What's going on, everybody? And welcome into the 116th episode of the Crazy One podcast. As always, I'm your host, Stephen Gates, and this is the show where we talk about creativity, leadership, design, and everything that helps to empower creative people. Now, remember, you can listen to the show, get the show notes, and a whole lot more. You can just head over to thecrazy1.com. It's the words the crazy and the number 1.com. Make sure when you also hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform so you get the latest episodes whenever those come out. And remember that the Crazy One is now on YouTube, where I'm doing career coaching, tutorials, masterclasses, past keynotes, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Again, you can just head over to thecrazy1.com/YouTube. Well, it's been a minute since I've done one of these. It's been a little bit of a hiatus. I think, if you're listening to the show in the past, you have no idea what I'm talking about because episode probably 115 is sitting there and 117 is next. But if you're listening to it in real time, it's been a couple months since I've done one of these shows. And so in coming back and writing the shows again, I wanted to take on a topic that we've talked about before. And that's how even the most successful creatives have this little secret that we all share, that if we're being honest, from time to time, we sort of feel like frauds. I think it happens to all of us. It happens at any part in your career, can come in different forms, and comes with different problems. And we've talked about this in the past. I think that the basics of this I went over in episode 69, sort of did a refresher or a fill-in with episode 96, after I had spent some time through a series of conversations, honestly, with like hundreds of different creatives all over the world, getting their opinion on what was going on. I wanted to revisit it, and I revisited it for this show because I think, look, it's not a secret that a lot of the content I do here is based on my experience. It's based on conversations that I'm having, things that I'm going through or seeing in other people. And I think a lot of this is that, especially with imposter syndrome in particular, we all, it's not a shock, have to admit that times have changed thanks to the pandemic and thanks to this new reality. A lot of us are working remotely. A lot of us are working differently. And that I think imposter syndrome was something that we rarely talked about when things were quote-unquote normal. But now that we've layered on these new problems, these new challenges, that's changed what imposter syndrome looks like, what it feels like, what causes it. So I'm going to use this episode to be able to go back and really be able to look at what, not only we'll just do a quick recap around just sort of what imposter syndrome is, but I want to go and really look at this through the lens of remote work, right? Like, why has remote work caused some new triggers there? How is it affecting us? That we're going to look at the 5 types of imposter syndrome again, partially because I think it's a good refresher, but also because we really need to look at how in this new world is it showing up differently, because this is something that's been at my doorstep. This is something that I've been experiencing. This is a big part of why the show went on hiatus or a break, or if I had sponsors, however I would position this in some sort of BS marketing way that's made it sound more deliberate and planned and less like I just didn't have motivation or know what to say. So as always with those sort of things, that's what I want to dig into. So like I said, for those who may have missed it, episode 69 was sort of the refresher on that. 96 was then sort of a deeper dive. But let's just start again for one quick second with the basics, because there are still times I talk to people, they've heard that term imposter syndrome, they're not quite sure what it means. So imposter syndrome is a psychological phenomenon where you essentially have this belief that you're inadequate, you're not good enough, your ideas aren't good enough, your insecurities sort of hold you back, despite probably a lot of evidence to the contrary. Now, maybe you think that when something doesn't work, right, the way that you expect on a project, that you're not good enough, or maybe you should let somebody else speak up next time, or maybe you don't want to take on leadership, or maybe it's just that little voice in your head, that little doubt that causes you to question yourself doing those sort of things. But I think often, at least for me and for others that I talk to, it's probably just best summed up by you have this feeling like you're a fake and hope that nobody finds out because you don't necessarily work or feel or present yourself the way that other designers do. Well, as I've said in the past, the part of this for me is that everyone, and that is everyone in all caps, has it in varying degrees. Because, and let's be honest, anybody who tells you they don't is either lying or is just emotionally, I don't know what, tone deaf or something, where they don't understand sort of what's going on with themselves. But the reason why this is because, look, with what it is that we do as creatives, creating is a personal act, right? And that anytime you make a mark on a blank page, you write a line of code, you write a sentence of copy, you create anything. It's a personal act. It comes from you, right? From that inner dialogue, that personal communication that comes out of that. And so, yeah, there's more emotion that is attached to that than like 2 + 2 = 4, because that's the right answer. Whenever you're doing creativity, there's not a right answer. So things like judgment and commentary and, if people don't like it, come into play. And look, and I think that, like most insecurities, this stuff has never really been discussed. And I think it, sort of manifests itself in a lot of different ways. So, I like I said, I think a little of this may be going back to the basics a little bit. But I think the way that it's manifested itself, the way that remote has changed this, I think there's really, for me, 3 big areas that I've experienced. And I've seen a lot of other people who I've talked to that they've experienced. And I think that these are either the effects of remote work, the triggers, the reactions, just the recalibration that we've had to go through. And I think we need to understand how these 3 pieces of context set us up to have to work differently, to think differently, to just sort of be aware of what's going on differently. Now, the first one of these is, I think that remote work obviously has created sort of a lack of context, because I think, and honestly, I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges of remote work, is that remote has really robbed us of the context of being around other people, of being able to walk by their desk and see what they're working on, or have that casual conversation over lunch, or going down the hallway, or talk about a simple problem, or do those sort of casual interactions and the context you would get from them, whether it was at work or events or being a part of the community or just any of those sort of casual things, for the most part, dried up. Now, some companies are good, and they're good at deliberately creating those moments. But I think that the problem is that whenever you don't have that, especially with creativity, I think that lack of context of how am I doing? Because, you're in a world where you just turn on your video camera and you talk to somebody probably almost primarily just about work for 30 or 60 minutes, often suffering from Zoom fatigue and just like, how can I get off of this call or have less of these? So you're also not necessarily seeking out any context, because being on Zoom more often doesn't sound like something that's a great idea. And I think that the problem with this is that often, I think for creatives, when we're robbed of context, it creates doubt of just, how am I doing? How do I measure myself? Because again, what we're working on doesn't have a right answer. The problem with that often is that whenever you rob yourself of that context, that doubt often turns into insecurity. And then I think ultimately that insecurity turns into imposter syndrome. We used to just see this with people that would sort of be individual freelancers or people who would work off site. Like it existed, but never in the quantity and the way that it does now. And I think, look, I think many people misread those symptoms as either some form of an insecurity. They don't recognize it as imposter syndrome. Like I said, maybe they think it's Zoom fatigue, or they're not used to this new way of working, or that I'm not quite sure that, many of us have really realized that if you're going to be working remote, these are going to be lasting things that we're going to need to deal with. And that often, I think that's why people misread it, is because of that even 18 months later, there is still a novelty and a newness in how we work. That remote isn't something a lot of people were used to. But I think that's the first one, is that real lack of context, because you sit in your house by yourself. Like, even if you're on video calls with other people, you just sort of see somebody from the chest up. Like the body language is gone, the interactions are gone. So a lot of the context is gone. I think the other one that, again, I think is probably pretty obvious, but I think maybe not a lot of people take the time to think about, is environment. Because, look, the lack of context, I think, often creates an internal mental battle. And that's that's compounded by sort of a physical component there as well. So I'll give you a very real example for me, that this studio where I record this show, this studio used to be my sanctuary and sort of my place away from what was traditionally my quote-unquote office. Usually somewhere in New York City or Long Island or something like that, where, from Monday through Friday, I would go in and commute into the city and go into my quote-unquote office, and that this space was the sanctuary. This was the place for my personal projects. Maybe it was for a little bit of freelance work. It was definitely for recording this show, but it was a place that always had a different energy. And I think that everybody experienced this, whether it was sort of being with your family all the time, whether it was, any of those sort of things that, we lost our commutes, we lost those office spaces, and that suddenly our homes, the places that we were used to getting away, suddenly became our home, our office, our school, all of these other things. And that was definitely my case, was that my sanctuary, this studio, suddenly became my full-time office whenever I moved into remote work. And I don't think I ever took the time to realize what that was going to mean, especially then when it was compounded with the pandemic that wouldn't let me escape to another space. So this place that was once the source of my energy became just an office. And that was a hard transition to go through, was the place that suddenly was my inspiration, my power, the place where I would come to write and do all these things, suddenly was the place I wasn't quite as psyched to be able to go to, because the energy and the context of that environment had changed. And I think I can tell that I think a lot of you have gone through this, working in a new place. And I think oftentimes if you ever talk to somebody, just watch this week when you're on Zoom. If you see somebody who's sitting in a different place, not only watch your reaction, that you tend to be surprised that they moved, but notice how their energy is different. That if maybe they're sitting downstairs on the couch, or the weather's been nicer, so they're sitting outside, or that again, it tends to bring a little bit more light, a little bit more energy. And so I'm not quite sure that we've really sort of understood how to construct an environment in a remote world to give us that energy, to create that sanctuary, to do what an office did, because again, getting it through Zoom alone doesn't work. And I think that combination of the lack of context that I think has caused sort of the mental doubt, coupled with that environment, physical location, working space, whatever it is for you, I think in many cases, again, has really led to a crisis of motivation. And here again, I think for a lot of people, a lot of creatives, whenever I will really lean into it, I think it's often being mislabeled as Zoom fatigue. But whenever you lean into them and you really ask and try to talk to them and say, look, or are you having a ton of Zoom meetings? It's like, well, no, this week I really didn't. Last week actually I didn't either. It's like, yeah, I'm not really sure why. I'm just not motivated. And I think this struggle for context and this change in physical environment has culminated in many people, and especially for me, in that loss of motivation. And as I said before, I mean, for me, this show didn't go on hiatus by mistake. For me, it was a result of, I think, one, I really felt like I'd lost my connection with the community that I primarily had through public speaking, and through, my home studio was turned into my office. And I think that as a content creator is often the challenge, is because if I'm not motivated, I'm not engaging in social media, I'm not posting articles, I'm not posting content to get feedback. I think a lot of people, when they look at you as a content creator, rarely reach out to just say like, hi, how are you doing? Most of the time there's an ask attached to it, and that's fine and it's understandable. I'm not saying that people should stop doing that. But I think it's just, you are often asked, and I think especially in a remote world, you are often asked to be the one who has to generate the energy, generate the motivation, because, I mean, one of the really telling things for me that I started to notice was just notice how often in a week do people ask you how you're doing? What can they do to help you? I think that a lot of this has made a lot of us very centered on us, very caught up in what we are doing. And I think that's what I went through. And as a result, my imposter syndrome really grew as I doubted if the insights that fuel this show were the things that, really, because I couldn't validate them with people out there. I couldn't validate them with community. I felt this sense of disconnection. I felt a lack of motivation. And as a result, my want to do this show really dropped through the floor as a result, right? That desk that used to be for creating my talks and recording these podcasts and episodes became my day-to-day desk. So it seemed to lose a lot of that charm and motivating power when this was a special place that I came to create the content for my talks or for the show. And I think it took me months to be able to understand that this shift was happening, that my imposter syndrome that I thought I'd had a pretty good handle on, that I thought that I'd had a pretty good sense around, had changed into something different. And that for me, like I said, it was a little bit too wrapped up in pandemic or remote work or a few other things that were masking me to really see what was going on. And I think only recently, this is why I wanted to come back. It's why I wanted to lead with this episode, was for me to start to spend more time with myself, realizing that this had gone on long enough, that something else was going on. And for me, it has been a hard and difficult road to see these three things, to figure this out, to see what was going on, to figure out why was something that I had loved so much for 5 years was something that I just suddenly just couldn't really sort of look into. And look, I think that there's some really big undercurrents that are going on right now. I think one is obviously the shift to remote work. I think two is that people in general are just reprioritizing or prioritizing their lives differently in terms of what they want to do, that these old hallmarks and these old markers of success where I have to like work like a crazy person to be successful, or that I have to put work first, or I have to live a particular place, or I have to do these things. These aren't the markers we're using anymore. You can see that in the way people are exiting big cities, and that, I mean, I think I read a study recently where 60 or 70% of people said they would take a not insignificant pay cut to be able to have better work-life balance and work remote. But I think that for a lot of us, while we are rebalancing our lives and looking at this, we need to understand that our creativity is going to rebalance with it. So I think I had to understand these forces that had reshaped my imposter syndrome and made it feel like something I hadn't really encountered before. So as a result, I want to take just a few minutes and revisit those 5 types of imposter syndrome that we've talked about in the past, but to do it with new eyes and new insights based on this new world, because I think it's, for a lot of us, we're going to need to go through and re-look at what this is to really feel like we are truly back in the groove on creativity and are able to recapture what maybe, even if you really enjoy remote working, I think for a lot of us, if we're really honest, we haven't found that creative groove. We aren't producing at quite the same rate. Maybe we are producing the same volume, but at least for me, it's not producing maybe quite the same quality. And that's really what I've been in search of for me at work, at the show, everything else, of like, how do I look at this and refine this? And so as always, I think making sure that we give credit where credit is due. I still use Valerie Young's approach on this subject. I continue to always reference and really like her book, The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women, Why Capable People Suffer from Imposter Syndrome and How to Thrive in Spite of It. In that book, she categorized this into 5 different subgroups. And generally, for me, these are the 5, and even if you read different articles, like maybe people give it different names, but generally this grouping is about what I think is right. They would be the perfectionist, the superwoman or the superman, the genius, the individualist, and the expert. Now, as we go through these, I always think it's really important to make sure that people remember that this is about balance. In many cases, as we go through these, having a small or manageable amount of these, I think can actually be a good thing. That because they can create drive, focus, motivation. They can keep pushing you to do better, to refine your work, to do those sort of things. The problem that we get into is whenever they overwhelm, they paralyze, they hurt your mental state, that's where they become problematic. And so that in a lot of cases, this is, and look, welcome to the repeating theme of this show. Even though we took a break, the theme of the show didn't. That in many cases, this is about balance. It's finding about what does this do for you? What are the things that this is for you? That there's not a magic formula here. But I do have some new thinking as we get through this, as we get towards the end of the show, about what you can do about it, how you can help others, and I think just what are the things that we need to change to really sort of have this make sense. Let's jump into this, and let's start with, and most of the time I start with this one because I think it often is the easiest one to start with, which is the perfectionist. And perfectionists are people who just set these excessively high goals for themselves, and honestly, when they don't match up, they don't measure up to whatever that goal is, they have major self-doubt and really sort of worry about themselves. And I think, this group is often labeled as control freaks, or again, they sort of feel like if they want something done right, they have to do it themselves. This approach creates obvious problems. in that creativity, there are no real right answers, and perfection is probably something that doesn't exist. So obviously setting it up that way creates, right from the beginning, sort of a really unrealistic expectation. But I think what's even worse for them is when success comes, it often really isn't very satisfying because they believe they could have done better. Whenever I look at my top three, perfectionism is definitely one for me. This is why I've done shows in the past that try to pull apart happiness and joy, because I think most of the time people don't necessarily realize that happiness is a target, meaning if I do this, achieve this, win this, get this title, this pay, whatever it is, then I will be happy. The problem is that those things are targets, and whenever you achieve them, yes, you will find happiness for a short amount of time. Usually for me, it's somewhere between 24 and 48 hours, and then the target recalibrates itself, which means you've moved on to the next thing, and suddenly you're not that happy anymore because there's now something else you have to go achieve. For me, a lot of in dealing with my perfectionism really came down to how do I find more joy, meaning really how do I learn to take the mistakes in stride, make them a natural part of my process, enjoy what it is that I'm doing, enjoy that process, and in many cases, I think, push myself to act before I was really ready. Now, the change here is that for remote work, I think it also helps to get together with members of your team, your family, your community, to actually celebrate achievement. I think it gives you some of that much-needed context that remote work has taken away, but I think it also helps you see that even when it isn't perfect, it can still have a pretty fantastic impact. But that idea to be able to get with other people, to work through it, to enjoy the journey, as cliched as that may sound, and again, to take those things in stride, just that shift in perspective, and I think often, again, trying to open up your creative process and share a little bit before maybe you are ready so it's not perfect. That is often a really profound and impactful shift because other people go on the journey. You can lean on them. They can help support you. They make the work better. Now, the next one is the number one imposter syndrome for me, which is the superwoman or superman. These are people who experience this phenomenon where they're convinced that they're phonies who are working alongside real deal colleagues, so they push themselves to work harder and harder to measure up. I'll often joke that I think this always manifests itself in sort of, for me, and again, I've said it before on the show, where I sort of find it funny because for me, sitting here and talking about things in theory is not very hard. But then having to show up and do it in person is where this really kicks in for me, because when you layer in people, teams, personalities, politics, organizational complexity, social environments, like a lot of these other things, these problems suddenly aren't quite so simple. This is why we're all in search of books and every podcast and everything else to help us with this. And, this used to be a one that I think was often, probably a lot easier to spot because these were people you knew who needed help or you could go in and support, because in many cases they would often show up earlier, work longer than everybody else. They would be in the office earlier, and even if you were done at 4:00, you would stay till 6 because you want to show everybody how seriously you take this. I think this obviously leads to some pretty unhealthy work habits that can cause burnout and a lot of other things. And I think, these are the people who have really, again, struggled as we have gone into remote work because you don't have that sort of easy way to be able to show people how hard you're working. I think in many cases, you're often now probably a little bit more aware of sending emails or Slacks or things like that outside the bounds of sort of core work hours, depending on your team, or again, with this increased focus on work-life balance, probably isn't going to be received quite as well as trying to show off to the people who are already in the office. So I think, again, that it's created a little bit of a perfect storm for these people to be able to start to figure out how to do this because, again, like the Superman or Superwoman, these are people that are really looking for external validation. They're looking for that recognition that they're working hard, that people are listening to them, that this is something that, again, they are having an impact. This is where, again, that being robbed of context, of the change in environment, hits these people extremely hard. And that I think in many cases what you see is a lot of companies or a lot of leaders or a lot of things like that are still trying to lead in traditional ways or older ways of working that aren't working. And for many of these people, it's just making this worse. And so I think it is that sort of recalibration to more of an internal validation. So you'll be able to sort of ease off the gas, gauge how much work you need to do, how much is needed, how much is healthy, what is the impact. And I think also in many cases, understand that if you're getting into a space that is unhealthy, to either be more vocal or to change your habits because of that lack of context and lack of physical cues that many people would see, that if you were suddenly working late into the night, everybody could see that you were staying too late or doing those sort of things. Now that that's not there, this falls on you to deal with a bit more, and that's hard. The next one is the genius. And these are the people who really struggle to judge because they want to judge their success based on their abilities rather than their efforts, right? So in other words, if they have to work hard at something, they really assume that they probably aren't very good at it. And it's just, they have an internal bar that is impossibly high. Now, there's a bit of a delineation here because I think perfectionists just want it to be perfect. The genius wants it to be perfect, but it's based more on if it is something that is a lot of work, right? Like perfectionists are fine putting in the work. Geniuses often, because these were the gold star kids or people who were smart or the head of the class or those sort of things, for them, it's much more centered around level of effort. And so I think that's often a delineation that's important. But I think you can see where this approach not only grows in remote work, right? Where learning isn't as easy, whereas so much has changed and everything is new, you have to learn and work in new ways and put in more effort. It's just the foundation of the shift that we've all gone through. So I think that's really caused an explosion in imposter syndrome among geniuses because now they're having to put in a level of effort that they aren't used to. And even if they were in a good place with it and had it really under good control, this has changed. And so, the traditional ways of being able to coach people through this is to get them to see that they're more of a work in progress and that, honestly, if you want to accomplish great things, that this is lifelong learning, lifelong skill building, and that these sort of short bursts in work aren't necessarily the right way to judge it. And that sort of instead of beating yourself up with these high standards, right? Like, how do you identify specific changeable things over time? Well, again, I think here the problem is that we're all being asked to put in the effort, to work in new ways, to work through all of this, as our companies are still 18 months later trying to figure a lot of this out. That often the accountability, those identifying changeable things, often it becomes a little bit harder because the people maybe you turn to, the support system you had who would help you with this, again, we're not around each other in the office the same way, and scheduling that like casual conversation is so much harder. So I think these are the things of the remote world that you need to be able to do is to try to get more of an accountability buddy, to give yourself a break and recognize that everyone is going through this so that this isn't something that is necessarily just a trigger for your particular type of imposter syndrome. This is something everyone is experiencing. While that may be hard to accept, that it's something that, again, becomes really important to understand. The individualist. So these are people who really think that if they need to ask for help, then that reveals that they're an imposter. And I think, look, it's okay to be independent, but not to the extent where you refuse help or that, again, like you feel like, doing that sort of affects your worth. And I think here, again, the problem is that the pandemic has forced almost all of us into being individualists. Because in so many cases, we don't have the context of an office or a team being around us or seeing other people. We have very individual experiences in that it is the context of our home, our family, a lot of these sort of things. So again, this has been a big trigger for people who suffered with the individualist imposter syndrome. And I think that this is something that, really has also probably in some people caused a rise in this that maybe they've ever seen for the first time. That this is not, because the individualist is something that you don't see in a ton of people, but I'm seeing it a ton more in a lot of people I'm talking to. Now, traditionally, to be able to fight this, right, this is about sort of, again, externalizing your process, trying to share your work, to share the things that you're struggling with, with a sort of trusted group of people, to feel, to make things smaller and to start more, be a little more comfortable and share over time. That's the traditional way of doing this. But here again, that ability to share work, to share, these often are things that now we have to be deliberate about. You have to be deliberate in when do you share out? How do you share out? How do you do working sessions? How do you do whiteboard sessions? How is it not just reporting on what has been done? And so again, that can be something that even if you want to do it and your team does not, you can find yourself in a really challenging situation. And so I think, for me, my best advice here is that if you're doing remote work, I think it really does help to set aside time to connect with people, to do team events, to do brainstorms, to just do whatever it is you need to do to not make every interaction about work about results, about putting you into that place where it's only about individual achievement. Because again, I think there's a bigger issue that many teams and companies are going through is that they sort of lost the plot on teamwork. And that, again, a lot of individual agendas are tending to win out over understanding the bigger needs because the individual context, I think, has put a lot of opinions and a lot of perceptions either out of balance or that people aren't realizing the amount of work you need to validate some of these things if you're going to have an opinion, or the level of work you need to put in to build the trust and the support system and the teamwork that probably used to be much easier. So we're carrying over these legacy benchmarks into a new way of working, and as a result, we're suffering the consequences. Now, the last one is the expert. And these are people who feel, honestly, like somehow they tricked their employer into hiring them, and that they live in a fairly decent and somewhat constant fear of being exposed as inexperienced or unknowledgeable. Now, look, there's always more to learn, and I think it helps you professionally and keeps you competitive in the job market if you keep doing this. But I think this tendency to endlessly seek out more information really turns into this imposter syndrome. And now, here again, I think that people who have the expert as a part of their makeup, here again, remote work has really exacerbated this, because what we're doing is it's hard to know if I know enough, because big shifts in working, big shifts in teamwork, big shifts in tooling, all of these things are really going to be very, very solid triggers for people who are suffering from the expert. And I think, traditionally the advice here, I think, probably does hold up a little bit better. Because in many cases, the advice here would be to do more just-in-time learning, to more acquire a skill when you need it, rather than hoarding it, so it doesn't give you some sort of sense of false comfort. But I think the other part of this, the other part of the advice, was that in many cases, you would try to get people to realize that there isn't any shame in asking for help when you need it. That if you can't figure something out, and you can't figure out how to get through this problem, seeking out advice from like a supportive team member or leader or part of the community was a really good thing. I think that needs to probably be put on steroids here. Because in many cases, that ability, because the burden, unfortunately, and honestly for all 5 of these, is going to fall on you much more than it has historically. Because here again, that sort of natural camaraderie, connection, context, environment that you would have when you were in an office isn't there the way that it used to be. And so in many cases, I think if you're a leader, you need to look at how do you really empower empathy around that. We'll talk more in a minute sort of around that. But it's just sort of how do you create the spaces for these conversations to happen, probably in ways that you maybe really haven't had to in the past. But let's look at this from 2 different sides before we wrap up here. I think the first one is like, again, let's look at how do you start to re-diagnose what is going on. And then I think if you're a leader or a team member, how do you show up? How do you look at this? How can you help other people? But let's start with you. And I think this really becomes important to, I think there's either a series of questions or things you can do that are a really good starting point. I think the first one, honestly, is to do what I've been doing, which is to recognize that something is going on and to really just ask yourself, where is this coming from? Right? That imposter syndrome voice might be trying to tell you something important. That if you feel a lack of value because your opinion is never asked or things like that, right? Like you're probably likely craving to use that voice, to be heard, to seek out feedback, to do these sort of things. So I think to not always look at imposter syndrome as a negative. That for many of us, I think our brains and our bodies are more intuitive to what we need than maybe we realize. I think in many cases where we struggle is that we don't necessarily take the time to listen. So I think to really look at, to think about it, right? Like treat it like a design problem. Sit down and brainstorm ways to communicate with your boss, your manager, your team, your friends, your family, to do it more, to be better at it, to find ways of doing it more effectively. But again, to be able to use that moment or use that discomfort and lean into it instead of running from it, just look at it and say, hey, look, where is this coming from? I think that in many cases, and this is something that is a pro and a con for me, is I think to really look at how can you use logic to functionally prove yourself wrong. As we talked about, as more of this is going to fall on you to figure out, unfortunately, until we can retrain leadership and look at new ways of working. I think that if you're constantly thinking, I don't belong here, or my work isn't good enough, or no one's going to like this, again, lean into that, question it, really look at, is that true? Because look, I mean, you landed in the role you're in, you've got the responsibilities that you have. Why do others belong and deserve their place, but you don't? Right? Because I think if you're running around with that, constantly thinking like, I'm going to get fired, or I'm not good enough, or nobody's going to like this, ask yourself why. Right? And especially if you push it to an emotional extreme, right? Like if you're always on the attack, always doing those sort of things, to really look at, again, like if you were to say, okay, look, I'm going to get fired, nobody's going to like this. Seriously, take a step back and like, what fireable offenses have you actually committed? Right? Not that somebody's going to disagree or those things, but like, again, if you're going to take it to that extreme, really look at that extreme and to say, look, did I really do something that could get me fired, or did I just have an unproductive week? Did I disagree with somebody? Am I searching to figure out what is going on? But again, to try to use logic, mostly whenever these get into the more extreme states, to walk yourself back so that the problems feel manageable. Because again, that lack of context can make us into an echo chamber that can make this all feel so much bigger than what it actually is. And once again, I think this is something I've had to remind myself about. And I think that, again, this show is a process of my self-discovery as well. I think historically, one of the things that I've done, but maybe I wasn't conscious about it, was I think to take a minute, to pause, to be able to take that moment to just reflect. But I think to welcome, or honestly, almost maybe even be grateful for those uncomfortable thoughts and feelings. Because for me, I think in too many cases, we internalize it, right? We take it as a bad thing. We say, oh, we're not good enough. We're not measuring up. I must be failing or falling down or whatever it is. I think if you take that exact same setting and pivot to a bit of a different perspective, to look at that way of feeling is that it is trying to tell you that something doesn't feel right, and that this is an opportunity to make a change. Maybe it's small, finding a different way of reframing your mindset, or a different way of working with the team, or doing things day to day. Maybe it's bigger, like making big changes, or looking, into what is really going on with you, or to try to open up more, be more deliberate. Maybe you decide like, hey, this is something I need to go talk to a therapist, or I need some new people, or I need a new environment. I need to make bigger changes. And you're seeing that. You're seeing a lot of people who are leaning into that. That's why they're changing cities. They want to be closer to family. They're leaning into it. But again, I think we find it easier to lean into that on the personal side than on the professional side. Because I think often on the personal side, we feel like we have more control. But the last one for me, and this is a long-standing technique, and once again, so remember, you can go to thecrazy1.com, find episode 116, find the show notes, and I'll post this in there. Is that one of the things I've done historically for me? I've done it multiple times. I've done it with a lot of different teams as I worked as a consultant and on other things like that, was to actually go through and to map out what is going on. So there are the 5 different imposters you go through, and you're sort of able to rate what it is. You end up with a map. And I think often at its best is you don't do this alone. You do it with other people. You do it with your team. You're able to compare, contrast, talk about why you think that, get an external perspective on if people agree that that is something, because we are often and will always be one of our own biggest blind spots. So you're able to validate, is that blind spot really true? Is that really going on? It creates a conversation that does take vulnerability to start. It takes vulnerability to lean into, but I think often comes out with extremely powerful results on the other side of that. So I think then there's also the flip, is that I think the mistake that I've made in past shows has been, I would only ever talk about what could you do. And I think the other part of this, and again, this doesn't matter where you are in a team, what your level of experience is, or anything else like that, to take a moment to think about how can you help other people. Because I think, like I said, that's one of the things we haven't maybe talked about enough. And here again, I think that there's 4 sort of things that I think are important to look at. The first one is in your interactions with people. Obviously, if you're a people leader, this is a slightly different conversation because your role is more impactful. But, to really look at, really fundamentally, what are some of the ways, or are you creating ways to give people the space to really speak openly? Because again, I think in a lot of cases what this comes down to is that people have a preset way that they want to work, a preset opinion. These are not new problems, right? This is a long-standing issue in leadership. And, that was my 3 years as a consultant was a masterclass in the organizational dysfunction of seeing this time after time after time. But I think to start with and just say, look, are you actually listening to other people? Because a lot of remote work, a lot of these settings has really got things into a place where I think it becomes very, very easy to just tell people what you think or what you want, because while that was easy before when we're all together, it has become astronomically easier in remote work. But I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, because I think it's just not the space to speak openly, is that do they feel safe to give honest feedback when they're in that? Because I think the ability to speak honestly, to have that psychological safety, this is something where, again, you have to empower vulnerability. And you have to lead with that. That if all you're going to do is talk over people, disagree with them, tell them that they're wrong, that they're not being listened to, that compounded with the disconnect that comes from remote, this is one of the big reasons I think why you see the Great Resignation. This is why I see people, even whenever they're changing into jobs that should look spectacular, are leaving within months. Because again, like they have just found the barriers to be bigger, the work to be harder. That there's been a real recalibration on how long people will stay, what they will put up with. And so I think it is imperative to all of us, whether this is just talking to a coworker, whether it's leading a team, a company, whatever it is, that we show people that their voices are valued. Right? I think that is one of the biggest things you can do to fight imposter syndrome, to create teamwork, to create trust. All the things that are so challenged in a remote workspace is to make sure that people feel valued, not talked over, not talked down to, not talked at. Because I think this is one of the biggest things that I've seen in this pandemic with so many teams is they have started working at each other and not with each other. And that is because, again, a fundamental breakdown in trust and psychological safety. But then I think a lot of that also then comes into what expectations are you creating for other people and for yourself. But in this case, let's just focus on other people. Because I think the other part of this is, if you want to help people, if you want to help fight imposter syndrome, is to give people time to do thinking, do the deep work. Don't expect them to be on at all times. I think this often is a byproduct of whenever we do digital work, is that just the boundaries between work and personal life continue to get deteriorated. This leads to burnout and all these other things. This is what we're seeing people push back against. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, the biggest thing you can do to help other people, one which I already mentioned, is I think to, one, empower empathy, empower vulnerability, to make people feel valued and listened to. Again, not talked at, not worked at, worked with, listened to. Just that simple positioning, that simple, rephrasing, I think helps them and you immensely. Because what you're doing there is you're creating conversations in spaces where it is okay to not be okay. We continue to, and again, I think we've had a little bit of a setback on leadership across our industry, where I long said that I feel like sort of one more generation of leadership needed to leave for us to start to make real progress. I think this has entrenched some of them. This has entrenched some of that bad behavior. And that, again, it has to be okay to not be okay. And I think I hear so many people who will talk about how, empathetic they are and how they do all this stuff, and then their actions speak to the exact opposite. But this is about a change of mindset for all of us. I think that this starts by accepting that there's been a lot of change. So things are going to be different. I think all of us need to look at this and say, look, whether it's the marks, the measures, the ways of working, the mentality, whatever it was that we brought from the way that we worked before, whenever we all worked in a particular way and could be in an office a particular way. Well, now we're a year and a half into this. We need to recognize and accept that things are going to be different. And I think when you're able to open your eyes to see those sort of things and then think about this, I think you're able to start taking stock of what is working and what isn't. This takes time. And I think to give yourself time to go through this. But like I said, to also realize how important other people are in this. Whether it's an accountability buddy, whether it's trying to lean in on your team or the people you work with, or doing a bunch of those sort of things that, again, I think these are all the things that become so important. Because, look, the names of those 5 imposters are still the same. I think the way we describe them are still the same. How they manifest, why they manifest, how they show up, those things are going to continue to be different for all of us. So again, I think that we need to really look at and recognize what has changed and why we need to change as well. this is an ongoing journey for me. I once again, I'm not going to sit here and say that just because I'm making this show, I have the answers. I think it's, this is something I'm still trying to figure out. Look, I'll be honest. I'm really hoping that in 2 or 3 weeks, I'm here with another show and that this imposter syndrome doesn't win again and I don't do 2 or 3 shows and then stop again, that I can find a way back to being more consistent around what this is. That's my hope. That's my mental health journey. That's the work that I need to be able to do, is to keep pushing and keep working through that. But again, I think by being open about it, by admitting it, by talking about those things, those are the things that I think really, really help and can make a really big difference. So we're going to go on this journey together. Keep sharing, doing those sort of things. And so look, I think as always, if you're going through this, if you want to sort of share what it is or ask questions or things like that, there's the long-standing way. Look, I mean, you can follow me on social media. So you can do that. It's where you can follow the show on LinkedIn or Facebook. You can follow me either on Instagram or Twitter. It's basically all the same thing. But again, I think to be able to get in there, ask, share, talk about what's working, what's not. If there's stuff you've discovered in here that you find is working really well, feel free to share that. If there are things that you've found along your journey, I'd love to hear about it. And I said this before, that I'll post that map for being able to do the imposter syndrome kind of mapping exercise. I'll stick that up on the CRZY1.com. Again, just going to episodes, just hit all. If you're listening to this in real time, 116 will be at the top. If not, scroll down to find it. And so again, I think that way we can all sort of start working through this together. So thanks for the patience. Thanks for sticking with me. Again, this has been an interesting journey even for me on this, so I appreciate you being a part of this. I think somehow it feels more relevant than ever the way I always close the show. And look, I think I'm so incredibly aware now more than ever with commutes and everything else having disappeared and people's time being so much more precious that time is really the only real luxury any of us have. I'm always and continue to be incredibly humbled you want to spend any of it listening to me. And then I think, last but not least, I almost forget. See, just, again, I've been away from the folks down in legal. They want me to remind you, as always, that all this show and everything else are just my own views. They don't represent any of my current or former employers. These are just my own opinions. And so finally, to wrap it up, and it's been a while since I've said it, so damn it feels good. Thanks so much. Keep going through this. We're going to figure it out together. And as always, stay crazy.